We're not in Mayberry anymore.
Robert Peel is largely considered to be the father of modern policing, and he came up with 9 Peelian principles. Look them up, they're important. Number 7 is vital. The police must maintain at all times a relationship with the public that gives reality to the historic tradition that the police are the public and the public are the police. The police being only members of the public who are paid to give full-time attention to duties which are incumbent on every citizen in the interest of community welfare and existence. They have no special powers which don't exist within the populace.
What if the police are apparently getting away with so much because we as a populace are failing in our fundamental duties? Okay, so folks, in order to understand what it is I'm hoping to accomplish, we're going to have to read the criminal code, a certain section, and we're going to have to interpret that in a certain fashion, and we want the courts to agree with that. Now, statutory interpretation is a very large field. I invite you to research it and look it up. You'll find that there are, at least for this purposes, 4 basic concepts. And I'd like you to be aware of these. First and foremost, plain reading. A plain reading of an act or a statute is always preferable. If you can avoid reading something into it, if a plain reading gives you a picture, that plain reading is sufficient. Secondly, harmony. Words can have more than one meaning, but not in an act. If it's used in an act or a statute, then that word, its definition, does not change throughout the act. They don't jump back and forth. A word, when used in an act, will have, even if it's used repeatedly and it has different definitions, it will only have that one definition every time throughout the act. Often, it will also be the same with other acts. There's harmony within them, within the meaning of the words. 3, exclusion. If you're reading an act and you come across a section and they include something in one section, they exclude it in another section, and then they include it again in the following section, you can't argue that, oh, they meant to include it in this section within which they didn't include it. When they exclude something in that case, they've done so purposely, willfully, and intentionally. And finally, surplusage, redundancy. You won't find it in the acts. If you are looking at, if you're trying to interpret what a word means, if you're trying to interpret what a section means, and you have a choice between two interpretations, and one results in surplusage, or superfluous words, or there's redundancy, you know that that is not the right interpretation. There's no surplusage. Now I want you to remember those 4 basic, very basic concepts of statutory interpretation. There's actually a lot more to it, but this should be enough for the argument I intend to present. There's another one that you need to be aware of actually, called justum generis, essentially birds of a feather, where you are mentioning a list of one thing. You've got a list of things, and then you say another list of things. That which follows is generally of the same class of the one previously. Now this is the case unless you are told otherwise. You know, essentially what this whole argument is going to boil down to is whether or not the people of this country have the right to employ other people of this country to preserve and maintain the public peace, or whether or not that is a function reserved to government. That's really what this fight boils down to. Now, in order to determine that, we need to examine the Criminal Code of Canada, specifically the definition of peace officer as found therein. Okay, so this entire argument is going to boil down to this right here. It's the definition of peace officer as found in the Criminal Code of Canada. Look it up on canley.org, 2 I's in Canley, and follow along with me here. It says peace officer includes, now let's stop there. See, you didn't have to follow far. They use the word includes. They don't use the word means. You'll find the word means in the definition immediately preceding this, where they say organization means, and then they give a list. The word includes can have two functions. One, it's exclusionary, and the other, it's merely illustrative. In an exclusionary sense, if you're not on the list, then you're not in. In an illustrative sense, these are merely examples of things which are peace officers, and it's entirely possible to have things which are peace officers which are not on the list. If you look in the definition, if you look in the Interpretation Act, the definition of person, someone tried to argue that the term person found in the Interpretation Act states person, or words descriptive of it, includes corporation, and tried to argue that it was being used in an exclusionary sense, and the courts ruled contrary to that and said no, it's being used in an illustrative sense, and that even though people aren't mentioned, they are included. That's what the function of the word includes is. It's illustrative. Now what this means is that it's entirely feasible and possible and arguable that there are people not mentioned in this list which can all still claim that they are peace officers. Now let's continue reading. Peace officer includes a mayor. Oh, let's stop again. What does this tell us? A mayor is a peace officer, but he's not hired by the federal government. He's not hired by a provincial government. He's not hired by the municipal government. He actually heads up a municipal government, and the key thing is he's chosen by the people. By the people. And whether or not they're acting within any election strategy or organizational structure doesn't matter. The key point is that the mayors are chosen by the people, and the people then have the right, clearly, to appoint someone, to elect someone, to choose someone, and to have that someone be able to claim that they are a peace officer. It is not a function restricted to government entities, according to the fact that he's a mayor. Now let's keep reading. Remember in statutory interpretation I mentioned that if something is included and then excluded, that you are to assume they excluded it purposely. When you read this, you will find that in Section A there's no mention of any other acts or statutes. In Section B, they mention the Corrections and Conditional Release Act. In Section C, no mention of any act. In Section D, they start mentioning the Customs Act, the Excise Act, and the Excise Act 2001. And then in every other section, they mention an act. What this tells us is that when it comes to Section A and C, they did not mention any specific act because no specific act was applicable. You have no right to claim that the persons employed under Section C or even Section A, mayor, warden, reeve, sheriff, deputy sheriff, sheriff's officer, or justice of the peace, you can't claim that they must be appointed, elected under any specific act. And the reason is that these are common law offices, and that we the people have the right and the power to appoint them, and that power doesn't come from any statute or act. Now the key part we need to look at is Section C. Section C states peace officer includes, and then Section C, a police officer, police constable, bailiff, constable, or other person employed for the preservation and maintenance of the public peace or for the service or execution of civil process. So let's look at that, because that's really what it's going to boil down to. Now, what we find is that in Section C, they're using the conjunction or. They don't use the conjunction and. Now, remember when I mentioned iustus generis, iustum generis, a Latin phrase which essentially means of the same kind. When they make a list, and this could be a potential argument, when they say they meant a police officer, police constable, bailiff constable, or other person, that they actually meant other persons who are also employed by federal, provincial, or municipal governments. However, the word or is a conjunction. The word and is a conjunction, and they have two opposite effects. The word or is a conjunction that acts to include that which would otherwise be excluded, and the word and acts to include that which would be included but simply wasn't mentioned. A justum generis would apply if the legislators had used the conjunction and in place of the conjunction or. But the conjunction or acts to include that which would otherwise be excluded, often completely contrary to that which was previously mentioned. Are you going out tonight or are you staying in? Two opposites. The legislators, I believe, chose the conjunction or in this place because they wanted to ensure that these other persons were not simply of the same previous class, but that they were excluded. And that would be simple to test. Just take that sentence, replace that first or with the word and see what the interpretation would be. And at that point, you would end up with other persons who must be of the same class as the previously mentioned one. Now, you can't end up with the same effect when you're using two conjunctions which have completely opposite effects. So the term or, in my argument, means that these other persons are not found in the same previously mentioned class, that a class of persons which would otherwise be excluded is now being included. Now we come to the real crux of it. This is going to be where the fulcrum in the lever actually lies. It says employed, or other person employed to preserve and maintain the public peace. Now what does that mean? Does that mean hired to fulfill a job? Because if so, then potentially maybe the municipal, provincial, and federal governments could argue that only they and only they alone can employ these other persons. But the word employed has two definitions. One means to hire someone, pay them a wage, and you establish an employee and employer relationship, and you hire someone to do a job. And the other means to make use of. Right now, I'm employing the English language. I'm employing computer software. I'm employing my camera. There's no employee-employer relationship. So these are two very different definitions. And the argument that only government agents can employ these other persons rests upon one definition being used, and that is hired to do a job. So let's look at that term. Now remember how I spoke about how statutory interpretation requires that you maintain harmony. The word employed is found 26 times in the Criminal Code of Canada. Check it out, do a word search. Read every time. You will find that there are 21 times where either definition could be used. There's certainly a level of ambiguity. But in 4 of those occasions, out of those 26 times, there's 4 where they are referring to vessels, equipment, and chemicals, I believe. And there is no way they could be using the term employed in that case where they're referring to someone employed to act as an employee. And then out of those 26 times, there's one time in particular where they actually use the word employed in reference to an employee because they actually use the term employed as an employee. Remember how when we were talking about statutory interpretation, surplusage or redundancy? If employed means employed as an employee and you substitute that in that sentence, you get employed as an employee as an employee. You get redundancy and surplusage. Note, the word employed, when used in this section, very clearly means to put to use, not to hire as an employee. And the argument that only government agents could in fact employ a peace officer rests upon that definition, that word having that definition. But it doesn't just stop there. Let's continue on. Because what are we looking at? We're looking at, or other persons employed for what? For the preservation and maintenance of the public peace, or for the service and execution of civil process. What this means is that these other persons can do 2 things equally well. equally freely. One is to preserve and maintain the public peace. Now let's talk about that, the public peace. Whose peace is it? Is it the Queen's peace, the police peace, the government's peace? Is it Harper's peace? Is it the court's peace? No, it's the public's peace. Based upon that, we know that the public has the greatest vested interest in the public peace. Clearly, they must have a right to preserve and maintain it. If not by proxy, then directly. But if they have the right to do it directly, then why wouldn't they, as a function of law, have a right to employ an agent for that purpose? Now, you want the cherry on the cake? Here it is. The other purpose that these other persons can fulfill is for the service and execution of civil process, commonly known as process servers. If anyone wants to claim that this section restricts the ability to employ other persons for the preservation and maintenance of the public peace to government entities, then they also must consequently claim that they and only they have the right to employ other persons for the service or execution of civil process, which means that you, as a member of the public, do not have the right to employ a process server, which means that you don't have a right to use the courts, but only the government does. If that's the case, they should just close up shop. They should pull in their shingle. No, the way I read this, the other persons employed for the preservation and maintenance of the public peace or for the service and execution of civil process can in fact be members of the public employed by other members of the public. And right now, members of the public can be employed for the service and execution of civil process by other members of the public. It happens all the time. So who's to say we can't employ each other to preserve and maintain the public peace? Folks, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to protect and maintain your ability to preserve and maintain the public peace as a member of the public. And I'm trying to protect your ability to do so directly and through an agency. I believe that if we want to stop Canada from becoming a police state, then everyone of sound mind and body should step up and accept employment and accept being employed by their neighbors to preserve and maintain the public peace, so that you can deal with police officers who might be breaching the public peace on an equal footing and as a peace officer. I think if we as a nation stand up and say we are all peace officers, then I think we take away from the police that monopoly. And that monopoly is necessary for the development of a police state. I don't want to see anyone claiming a monopoly on the ability to preserve and maintain the public peace. That is the gravest danger to the public peace. The money that I collect is going to be used for legal action to secure judicial recognition as peace officers to bring this argument I've shared with you before a proper court of competent jurisdiction so that we can secure a judicial ruling. It's going to be used for a member's defense fund. It's going to be used to set up a national not-for-profit association and organization. It's going to be used to establish an executive council which operates across Canada, a national one, and then a series of provincial ones. And it's going to be used for a public awareness campaign and then for training and equipment. I'm trying to stand against forces which have untold billions at their disposal. I'm standing against the very power of the state and their claim that they and they alone may field peace officers. I need money to stand against them. I'm not rich. I don't even have a bank account, really. But if we put all of our efforts and if we work together, we can in fact establish this for not a whole lot of money. If 10,000 people sent me $10 each, I would be able to bring legal action which would establish this right. So anyways, if you love your country, if you believe that you do in fact have the right to preserve and maintain the public peace, if you actually see it as a duty, if your interpretation of the criminal code is the same as mine, if you don't believe that there's hidden underlying premises and tripwire assumptions within these words, and that only blue-eyed, left-handed people have the power to preserve and maintain the public peace, if you believe in a plain reading of these acts, if you don't want to see Canada become a police state, and you want to see the people of this country secure the judicial right to preserve and maintain the peace, then I ask for your support. Thank you for your time.